That's lovely stirring music to get us off to a good start this evening. So welcome to the latest of our Bootham Talks. On Saturday, as part of our parents programme, we had a speaker join us from Australia, and we're heading to a completely different part of the world this evening to welcome in a minute Jules Evans, a philosopher who's going to be talking to us from Costa Rica. He went there for 3 weeks. He stayed there for 3 months to write and to hold on online philosophy courses. So we'll be crossing to him very shortly from snowy Yorkshire. Jules is known to us at school. He came to us about 3 years ago and took part in a conference that we organised looking at the shape of the future world, and spoke to us on that particular occasion about philosophy and its importance in preparing young people in particular to function well and safely and healthily in an ever-changing world. So it's lovely to have him back with us. To introduce him, he is currently the Policy Director at the Centre for the History of the Emotions. What a great name. At Queen Mary University, London. He is a practical philosophy teacher and has worked with organisations such as Saracens Rugby Club, who, given their fortunes last term, probably need him. And also in prisons and various places like that. He's worked on the BBC, done a lot of broadcast work, written in many different magazines and esteemed journals and newspapers, and helps to run the London Philosophy Club, which is, I'm told, the biggest philosophy club in the world. So it's a huge privilege for us and a great pleasure, all the way from Costa Rica, to welcome Jules to come and speak to us this evening. Welcome, Jules. Lovely to have you back, and we're looking forward to hearing what you're going to say.
Thank you for having me. It's lovely to be back at Bootham. My brother, Alex, has given a talk there as well, and I'm from a York family, a kind of Quaker family, who I think were even involved in helping to set up Bootham, whatever it was, decades ago. So this is the only ever school I think I've spoken at twice. So I feel a lovely connection to this. Yes, as Chris said, I'm speaking from Costa Rica, where the internet is okay. If there are any problems, Luke is going to jump in and help me, and I'll switch to a different signal or something like that. But fingers crossed, it's all okay. Chris, just let me know if the slides are coming out right. I think so. Yeah, just give me a thumbs up if the slides are there.
Slides will come up. Yeah. Jules, just worth saying to people if they've got questions as they go through, because we'll have a sort of half an hour or so of chat and then some questions after that. Just pop them either on YouTube or Facebook, whichever you're watching, in the chat at the bottom, and they will come to us in the sort of studio, as it were, and we'll be able to see those. But yeah, what you're seeing on your screen now, Jules, is what everyone else is seeing too.
Okay, great. So yeah, I'm going to talk about practical philosophy and how it can help us in a pandemic. I came across this picture of Socrates on a mask, and I think I like that image because we can think of philosophy as kind of helping us to practice mental hygiene. Ideas can massively improve our lives. Bad ideas can make our lives a lot worse. And so philosophy and critical thinking is a way to just practice mental hygiene in terms of what we absorb and what we share. So I'm a writer. I've written these books over the last kind of 10 years or so, basically looking at practical philosophy, how philosophy can improve our lives. I've even been an in-house philosopher at a rugby team at Saracens. See if you can spot the non-rugby player in that group. That was before, in their championship winning seasons, before it all went wrong. But that was a fun experience, just teaching philosophy to people like Owen Farrell there. I got into philosophy. I didn't study it at school or at university. I got into it in my 20s when I discovered philosophies like Stoicism and Buddhism. And they were a huge help to me because I suffered from bad anxiety from the age of about 18 to the age of about 24. So really kind of crippling anxiety and what was diagnosed as post-traumatic stress. And philosophy was a huge help to me and really helped me to learn how to take care of my emotions and how to be resilient in difficult times. So we can think of the pandemic not just as a physical health crisis, but as a crisis in mental health, as an economic crisis, and as a political crisis. And we could also think of it as part of a wider meaning crisis. A lot of people are struggling to find meaning at the moment, and that might be why they're turning to things like conspiracy theories as a kind of, as an attempt to find meaning. So can philosophy help us with these different kinds of crises that we're in? I think it can. So what I'm going to do in my 30 minutes before we go over to you for your questions is I'm going to just share three ideas from three philosophers. Think of them as my fantasy philosophy team. We've got Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic philosopher and emperor of Rome, the Buddha, and John Stuart Mill. So three ideas from these three philosophers. And what they have in common is the idea of how to be flexible and pragmatic and adaptive in our thinking, rather than rigid and fossilized. How to be nimble in our thinking. So I think of this, it really is, those are my principles. And if you don't like them, I have others. And I think that's admirably flexible and pragmatic. The less we get stuck in our thinking, the more flexible we can be in our perspective, the better we can adapt to difficult circumstances. So first of all, we're going to look at Marcus Aurelius. He was around in the 2nd century AD, and he was the emperor of the Roman Empire. That meant he was the most powerful person in it, who were, for example, there was the Emperor Nero, a homicidal narcissist who had his mother and his wife murdered. He was such a narcissist that he entered himself in the Olympic Games in the chariot racing, and even though he was thrown from his chariot, he refused to concede defeat and insisted that he was the winner. And he was famously distrustful, murdered a lot of his close advisors as well, including the philosopher Seneca, who he put to death. So he wasn't a great emperor. Even worse was Caligula, who was also a narcissist, insisted on being worshipped as a god, as many emperors did, and was so inflated in his self-opinion, he once actually declared war on the sea and demanded that his soldiers go and attack the waves because some of his ships sank. So he had an incredibly mad and inflated sense of himself. Or there was Domitian, a kind of bullying tyrant who once insisted that all philosophers had to shave their beards off. And any true philosopher will tell you they would never do that. So there was a philosopher called Epictetus who said, "Take off my beard, rather take off my head." And so Domitian banished all philosophers from Rome because philosophers were seen as dangerously independent in their thinking. So not a great lineage of previous kind of emperors. But Marcus was somewhat better than that. He was considered one of the few wise emperors or good emperors. For one, at least, he didn't go mad. He didn't declare himself a god. He didn't demand to be worshipped. And maybe he kept hold of his sanity because he was trained as a young man when he was at school in Stoic philosophy. He wrote a book called The Meditations, which was his private journal of him practicing certain Stoic ideas as he dealt with the many challenges of his job, the many challenges of empire. And those challenges included war with kind of barbarian hordes at the border. If you've ever seen the film Gladiator, you'll see Marcus Aurelius fighting the Goths. There were also great fires, and there was a pandemic during his reign as well. So he used Stoicism to cope with all of these challenges. And this book, Meditations, is still incredibly helpful to us. And in fact, as this article in The Guardian noted, the meditations have been very popular during the pandemic. Its sales have kind of gone through the roof. Everyone from like Zadie Smith and others have looked to the meditations to help them during lockdown. By the by, I think there's an episode of In Our Time, that great Radio 4 series, on In Our Time next week. So listen out to that. So why is Stoicism helpful during difficult times like now? The reason emergencies are hard is that we can feel at the mercy of our involuntary emotions. We can feel the slave of circumstances, constantly being buffeted by more bad news. And that's extremely demoralizing. We can feel helpless, really, and just at the mercy of circumstances. So in order to become more resilient, we can start to think about how do emotions arise and how can we change them. And the Stoics were great at understanding emotions and how to change them. You might think of Stoic as meaning never showing emotions, denying or repressing your emotions. That's the popular understanding of philosophy. Were very emotionally intelligent. They were very good at understanding how our emotions arise and how we can change them. They understood that our emotions are attached to our opinions, how we think. This is a Stoic philosopher called Epictetus. He said, people are disturbed not by events, but by their opinion about events. It's not what happens to you that causes you suffering, it's your opinion about it. It's how you think about it, your perspective on it. The same event could happen to two people and they would have completely different emotional reactions depending on their interpretation of that event, their frame, what they tell themselves about it. Marcus Aurelius writes in his book, life itself is but what you deem it. In other words, reality is constructed by our opinion of it, our frame, our story. So our emotions are created by our thoughts, beliefs, values, and perspective, by the story we tell ourselves about who we are and how the world is. The problem is that often we are not aware of our habitual beliefs, opinions, and perspective. They are often unconscious and automatic. As another philosopher, Socrates, put it, we sleepwalk through life. So we don't really notice our automatic thoughts, beliefs, and judgments. We don't question them. We assume that whatever our automatic mind tells us is completely accurate and true, like a kind of inner Reuters, let's say, like a reliable news source, when in fact it's more like an inner, I don't know, say like an inner Fox News or some other media agency, if you like Fox News, that maybe doesn't always check its facts, that's rather biased, that jumps to conclusions and generalizations. So our automatic judgments, our initial judgments, are often wrong and they cause us suffering. So what Stoicism tries to teach us is you are not your automatic thoughts. You don't have to automatically accept your thoughts and judgments. You can learn to step back from them and situation definitely wise. Is there another way I could look at this situation? In Greek philosophy, this is known as the Socratic method. Socrates would walk around Athens, engaging people in conversation, asking them questions to try and wake them up from their sleepwalking and to get them to think about their habitual automatic story and say questions like, is it definitely true? Is it wise? Is there another way I could see this situation? Often we pick up our beliefs, our values, our story from our family or our culture or our friends or from YouTube, and we swallow it without thinking. And that can cause us suffering. So Socrates is trying to teach us to examine our automatic beliefs. He said the unexamined life is not worth living. So this was hugely helpful for me when I had anxiety, because I realized that what was perpetuating my anxiety and my suffering was my own beliefs, my own thoughts and judgments, my own values. I was doing it to myself. A lot of our suffering in life is self-inflicted through our own thinking. And it's an epiphany when you realize that, oh wait, I'm doing this to myself. My own thoughts are causing me suffering. And I don't have to think like that anymore. In my case, I had automatic thoughts like, other people must approve of me, and if they don't, it's a disaster. That was my unexamined automatic life philosophy. And I realized it was causing me suffering, and I could change it. I could choose to think differently. So 2 useful terms for becoming resilient. One is cognitive distancing. What that means is you are not your automatic thoughts. You don't have to accept. You can choose a new perspective. You can choose a different frame on life circumstances. So really a lot of Stoicism is about learning to be a bit like a good film director. Learning to be efficient. What kind of camera angle? Do you zoom out? Do you zoom in? Is learning that flexibility of viewpoint. For example, Marcus reminds himself when external conditions are really getting him down, he reminds himself that he's not a god, that there is a limit to his control over circumstances. He says, vex not yourself at the course of things, they heed not your vexation. So if he's struggling during a pandemic, he says, well, there's only a certain amount I can do in this situation. Stoics also like to try to reframe hardship, reframe adversity, and to see it as a possibility for growth, inner growth. Epictetus says, difficulties reveal people's characters. So difficulties can be an opportunity to try and develop your inner moral qualities. Seneca says, the Stoic sees adversity as training. The obstacle becomes the way. This does not mean, by the way, just being toxically positive. Always, even this pandemic, sometimes brought out good things in people. It hasn't been a total catastrophe. This is a report my brother and I did, looking at how people cope with the pandemic, particularly with the first wave. We found that people reported feeling closer to their families since the pandemic began. We noticed that thousands of mutual aid groups have sprung up. People have been volunteering, giving their time, even risking their lives to support other people. People say they've appreciated nature more since the pandemic began. Psychologists have found that the most important way people have coped is through creative hobbies such as reading, gardening, or online learning. In fact, 10% of British people say they've looked to philosophy and psychology for a sense of meaning during the crisis. In other words, these kinds of difficult circumstances sometimes bring out resources we didn't realize we had within us. We are developing these resources, and when this awful situation is over, in some ways we'll be stronger. Okay, the second philosopher I want to look at, the second idea I want to look at for how to cope with difficult times comes from Prince in India. People think he lived in around the 6th century BC. Obviously than this man, but this is just a picture to give a sense of the luxury in which the young prince Gautama lived. And his father surrounded him in incredible luxury. He wanted for nothing. He had a beautiful wife, a harem, incredible riches. And this was because there was a prophecy that the Buddha would leave behind his royal life and go on a spiritual search. And his father really didn't want this to happen. So he kept him in this real bubble of luxury. But it didn't work. When the Buddha was about 18, he had a spiritual crisis. And he left the palace and went looking for spiritual truth. He started to follow the holy life, which is really every parent's kind of nightmare. He had a gap year crisis, you could say, and started to hang around with Indian holy men and tried to learn their techniques of meditation and kind of asceticism and so on, trying to find liberation from suffering. And he was extremely determined in this and kept on looking. So this is, you could say, in terms of every parent's nightmare. This was the Buddha after his spiritual awakening, leaving behind his luxurious lifestyle. That's an Ewok, by the way. I don't know if Return of the Jedi is before my audience's time. So he ended up sitting under a tree, a Bodhi tree, a sacred fig tree in the north of India. And he said, I'm going to sit and meditate until I discover the secret to liberation from suffering. And he sat there in deep meditation for hours and hours. And finally, he reached a kind of breakthrough. And he reached 3 deep insights. They're known in Buddhist philosophy as the 3 gateways. And they're still hugely helpful to us today. The 3 insights were, firstly, everything is impermanent. In Pali, the language Pali, this is known as anicca. You can compare this idea, it's that everything is constantly changing and flowing, arising and passing away. There's a similar idea in Stoicism, in fact, which was inspired by the Greek philosopher Heraclitus. Heraclitus said, everything flows, nothing stands still. Reality is constantly flowing to the same river twice because things are constantly changing. You think about how your body is constantly changing. The cells are constantly renewing, hair falling out, new hair growing. So all of reality is like that, in this constant process of flux. And that is actually helpful to remember, that everything passes. Poster that someone put up earlier in the pandemic, everything passes. When you're in hell, Churchill said, keep going, because even the difficult times pass, but also the good times pass too. This is just the nature of reality. So the Buddha says we shouldn't get too hung up on the really good times and too averse to the really bad times. We should recognize they're always in the process of changing. The second insight he came to is that nothing has a permanent, eternal self. This insight is called anatta, which means no self. What he means by that, it's connected to the first insight. Everything is in a process not of being one thing, but of becoming. Reality is a constant kind of things arise and pass. Everything depends on everything else. Everything is interconnected. And yet we think of reality, we freeze it into these separate concepts. We talk about something called a tree, for example, when in fact a tree, if we looked at it from a certain time perspective, is just a flowing from one state to another. It's in the process of becoming, from a seed to a piece of furniture to ash. A tree doesn't exist as a separate thing. It depends on oxygen, on soil, on sunshine. All of these things are interconnected. So there is no separate thing called, not in any permanent sense. It's flowing and becoming. Likewise, say, there's nothing really permanent and eternal called York. There's a set of temporary circumstances which exist for a little bit of time, and we give it the name York. But it's not permanent or eternal. There was a time before York, there will be a time after York. So everything in reality is like this, including our most cherished of all concepts, which we put a great lot of energy into trying to make permanent and eternal, which is our sense of self, me, who I am. We are desperate for that certainty, for proof of that we are something worthwhile. We're like someone who's built a sandcastle and wants to protect it. So we put a lot of energy into trying to fix this kind of me concept. And that leads to the third of the Buddha's insights, which is dukkha. Ordinary life is suffering. What he means by that is that our thoughts, and particularly our me thoughts, create a lot of our suffering. We think things like, I must always be like this, or the world must always be like that, or I mustn't feel like this. We have these rigid self-concepts, these rigid concepts about what we're like, and that causes us suffering. Because our self-concepts are kind of rather fixed and inflexible, whilst reality is constantly flowing and changing. So when we have rigid self-concepts, we will end up really in conflict with the flow of reality. And the Buddha taught that more we believe in our rigid kind of self-concepts, the thicker the walls of our kind of mental prison. For example, having trauma, that I am broken, I will always be broken, and I will never be happy or capable of a flourishing life. This is what you can think like if you have trauma. And this was a very fixed belief that I held on to very hard. And to get better, I learned to really let go of this belief and be a bit more flexible, and to see that it's just a story that I was telling myself and not really the whole truth. So again, the Buddha is teaching, like the Stoics taught, that mental health and wellness depends on being flexible in our thinking, not too attached to particular beliefs. Again, it's this idea we are not emotional experiences arises. This is a kind of Buddhist technique we can do. When a painful emotion arises, for anxiety or sadness, we can practice this technique. It's called RAIN. Recognize what we're feeling. Oh, I feel anxiety. Accept it. As soon as we accept a difficult experience or a difficult emotion, we take the edge off it. We heal it. If I'm feeling anxious and I accept that I'm feeling anxious, it eases down. If I refuse to accept my anxiety, it gets worse. We can then investigate and look at it. What is the nature of my anxiety? How is it changing? Is it always one thing, or is it fluctuating? Is it in a particular part of my body? Is it attached to a certain idea or perspective? And finally, we can non-identify with it. You are not your emotions. You are not your thoughts. You are not your physical experiences. These arise in your awareness, and you can accept them and remind yourself that they mean you are essentially an anxious person. So we have to be careful about how we label I'm just like a loser, I'm no good, and we've been very critical in our self-talk. So the Buddha would say, or Taoists would say, be like the river. A river just flows through circumstances, easy circumstances, very hard circumstances. It adapts itself to all these changing circumstances and just moves through them. Or they might say, be like the sky. The contents of our experience, our thoughts, our emotions, are like clouds passing through them. You can observe them passing through them without being too identified with them. Our thoughts occur to us, but we are not our thoughts. We can watch them come and go. Okay, so for the last kind of just 5 minutes before I open it up for questions, I'm going to look at John Stuart Mill. Mill is useful because we're not just in a physical and mental health crisis. We're in a political crisis as well. Around the world, democracy is in decline. Regimes are being overthrown. Last month, there was an attempt to overthrow an election in America. Recently, there's been a coup in Burma. So authoritarianism is on the rise around the world. This is a global democracy index from The Economist showing how authoritarianism is rising, and democracy is in decline right around the world. Governments are using the pandemic as an excuse, not just to protect their citizens, but sometimes to really control them as well. So I want to talk finally just about
Looks like we've got a bit of a hitch on the treacle tin and the string going to Costa Rica. So we'll just hang on for a little minute and wait to see if we can get Jules back with us, because we are just getting into John Stuart Mill. As we were, I'm going to do a little book recommendation. Oh no, he's back. That's fine. We've got you. I was about to recommend a book. So you're back with us. You were just introducing John Stuart Mill to us. So. And it looks like we've frozen again. Oh, here we are. So here's my book recommendation. Little book, as Jules was saying, at the beginning of the pandemic, that the Stoics made a bit of a break. There's a little book here called The Little Book of Stoicism. It's a book that I purchased at the beginning of the pandemic and found really, really helpful as a sort of very simple starter to Stoic philosophy. And it helped me a great deal at the beginning of the pandemic in particular, to get that sense of being able to sort of cope with things that are thrown at you. So Jules is back. He's nodding. That's always a good sign. And hopefully John Stuart Mill won't trip us up for a third time.
So, sorry about that, Chris. So Mill had an unusual childhood. He was raised to be a genius. He was fluent in Greek by 3. He was studying Plato by 4. So he was raised by his philosopher father and his godfather, who was Jeremy Bentham, another philosopher. By the by, this weird education wasn't very good for him. He had a breakdown when he was a young man because he felt his education was too analytical and not really emotional enough. And he had a kind of breakthrough by reading Wordsworth. Wordsworth, he said, was like a medicine for the mind. But he developed this fascinating philosophy, which I think is very helpful. What he thought was a real risk in democratic societies was the risk of mass conformism, of the tyranny of majorities. He said there is a risk when society is itself the tyrant, society collectively over the separate individuals who compose it. So what he wanted to do was think, how can we create a society which encourages and protects heretics, eccentrics, people who practice unusual experiments in living? He wanted a society which encouraged originality, which encouraged people to go off and do their thing and to kind of come back and say, look, I tried living this way and I had these results. So we could learn from these eccentrics. I think in terms of, the Quakers, really, someone like George Fox and other Quakers, these were originals, heretics, eccentrics, who suffered often a lot of persecution during their time, both legal or just being shunned and ignored. And so Mill is thinking, how can we create a society which supports and encourages these kinds of original thinkers, these kinds of original livers? And he laid it out in his book On Liberty, one of the classics of philosophy. He says the object of this essay is to assert one very simple principle. And that principle is that the sole end for which mankind are warranted, individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number is self-protection. So you can't interfere with someone for their own good. You can't force them to live a life because you think it's good or wise or virtuous. You can only stop them doing what they want if it's kind of harming someone else. The only purpose for which power can be exercised is to prevent harm to others. So this is to try and create the conditions to let people experiment with life. And he thought that an important part of this was to tolerate free speech and diversity of opinion, and to learn to be comfortable in a culture where there's lots of different competing opinions. Why then should we tolerate free speech? Why should we tolerate diversity of opinion? First of all, Mill says, there's a chance you might be wrong, that your opinion might be wrong. So it's useful to debate and listen to alternative opinions. Secondly, even if you're right, it's good for your nimbleness of thinking to defend your opinions. It stops you getting ossified, stuck in your ways. It keeps you mentally youthful to argue and debate with someone who disagrees. Third, he said that truth is pluralist. No one philosophy or ideology captures all of the truth. So it's useful to hear alternative viewpoints, because they might capture something of the truth, even if they're wrong as well. He also thought that we should encourage free speech because it creates a marketplace of ideas. His book on liberty came out the same year as Darwin's Origin of Species. So there's this similar idea of a kind of jungle of ideas, and they will compete, and the best ideas will win out, just like the fittest kind of animals will win out in a jungle. And finally, a culture in which we tolerate free speech and diversity of opinion is a good environment for geniuses, oddballs, and heretics. And he thought it was these kinds of oddballs that really helped society to evolve. The people who don't think the same as everyone else, the heretics. Why is this important now? Because we're in a situation where really liberal democracy is under threat by rising authoritarianism and groupthink, both on the right and on the left. Both on the right and the left, there's authoritarian attempts to close down free speech, free thinking, free democracy. And worse, we're losing the ability to debate and disagree with people who have different political perspectives to us. Democracy, Mill taught, is a communal project. We're all in it together, but we've lost the sense of that and replaced political debate with contempt for those who think differently, miscomprehension and suspicion. People literally can't imagine why someone might say vote for Brexit or be a Remainer. They can't imagine why someone would vote for Trump or vote for Biden. The other side just seems completely clueless or even evil. So there's a real polarization, and that leads to a kind of entrenchment of position. Maybe you see this on social media. People become more and more emotionally just fixed and fused with a certain perspective, completely lost in it, unable to step back from it. They lose all kind of epistemic flexibility, by which I mean flexibility of thinking, the ability to see from different perspectives, the ability to understand where someone else is coming from. What happens when a democratic society loses its ability to debate and disagree and to see where someone else is coming from? Democracies fail. Civil wars happen, and democracies get replaced by authoritarian regimes. There's a risk we're all taking liberal democracy for granted. And so we need to fight for it and stand up for it. And part of that is developing the skills to be a democratic citizen, which means learning epistemic flexibility, the ability to understand multiple viewpoints, to think your way into someone else's position. We need to develop that skill if a multicultural democracy is going to survive. So that's it. Sorry I went a little over, and I'd love to hear some of your thoughts and questions now.
So if you've got thoughts and you've got questions for Jules, just type them into the comments section on Facebook or on YouTube, and we can pick those up as we come along. Jules, a question for you. I wonder what John Stuart Mill would have made of Twitter.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I did a session on this recently about whether Trump should have been banned from Twitter. Is that an infringement of free speech? Was he inciting violence? Mill thought there were certain restrictions on free speech. One of them, for example, was if you're selling a goods and you lie about that. Quakers were famous business people because they were very honest in their advertising about what was in there, like cocoa, for example. So that was one of the limits on free speech. You can't lie about what you sell. Another was if you're inciting violence. And there was a feeling that Trump was inciting violence, and that was why he was banned from Twitter. But I think Twitter, in a way, has been, I would say, a disaster for civil discourse, for civility. It encourages knee-jerk, automatic thinking, and just kind of looking for the person on the other side of your argument who's the most ridiculous, and then using them as an example. Oh, look how ridiculous the other side is. Look at this tweet. So in a way, this is the problem with the internet. In the 90s, people thought the internet would be this wonderful kind of global village where we would all join together in this kind of polite civil discourse. And in fact, it seems to have brought out the worst in us, and to really have harmed democracy quite badly within a few years. So yes, I think we need to think about how can we improve the level of debate on places like social media, but without just shutting them down and completely freezing free speech. And I think everyone's trying to figure out how to do that.
Terrific, thank you. A question from Mike Shaw, one of my colleagues at Bootham, who says, I love the phrase oddballs and heretics. I think it's almost a cornerstone of Quaker education. How do we actively nurture it? And I think I was thinking the same sort of thing as Mike was, as you were talking to us.
It's so interesting, isn't it? Like, how does an educational system do that? I mean, I'm quite interested in something like character education. Like a school having certain virtues or character strengths that it makes part of its culture. And one of the roles in education, this is something the ancient Greeks thought, is to enculturate young people, to pass on certain values and a certain ethos. But the risk of that is that you end up with conformism. Everyone is just drilled, like in a kind of, like maybe in a certain kind of the cliche of a school in Beijing, for example, drilled in certain values and not given the capacity to question them. So how do we find the balance between the need to pass on values, but to give a space for young people to criticize those values as well, and to be original and think for themselves? That takes a certain nimbleness in the teachers, I think, to recognize, yes, we're passing on these values, but values aren't just written in stone. They're living kind of, living cultures. And there are times when someone might, break the rules and, you're kind of gentle in how you punish it because you important kind of element of hereticism and originality into it. Let me give you one example from the work I did with Saracens. Saracens had key values that they always repeated over and over. resilience, discipline, work rate, and so on. But we would sometimes do philosophy clubs where we would discuss these values, and we'd say things like, is work rate always a virtue? Can you be a workaholic? Are there times when it can be too excessive? In other words, we would try to kind of critically reflect on a certain value and think, what does that mean in practice? Are there times when you could, do you see what I mean? So it's trying to create that balance between just passing on values and really soaking young people in those values, but also giving them the room to kick against them and be original. And I think, I don't know, good schools create quite strong boundaries which almost foster rebels. Like my school was quite good at producing rebels because it had quite strong boundaries, to kick against.
Thank you. Go to a question from Richard Ronald, who picks up the fact that you've included these three philosophers. He picks up on Confucius and on Jesus as two other philosophers you might have looked at. Why was it these three in particular that you landed on for us tonight?
Well, I only had 30 minutes, but I wanted to bring in Lao Tzu because Lao Tzu has this great line. There's a lot I could have talked about. I'd like to talk about learning to hold your opinions lightly, and how, in a way, I feel like the pandemic, I've become more agnostic during the pandemic. Like, I've learned to be wary of my opinions and of holding opinions too strongly. And I've been prepared to accept how little I know. And Lao Tzu says, the way of knowledge is the accruing of opinions. The way of the Tao is letting opinions go. And the more we let opinions go, the more we become like water, able to adapt to circumstances. So I'd have liked to have mentioned Lao Tzu as well. Yes, I suppose Stoicism is the philosophy I know best. I'm particularly into Buddhist philosophy at the moment, and I've been just thinking a lot about John Stuart Mill in the last few months. So that's why they were on the bench. But I hope to give Jesus and Confucius a good run out next time.
Yes. Lots of sporting analogies that we won't go into. We'll have to invite you back to be the first school you've spoken at 3 times, if that goes on. Nancy, a couple more questions here on sort of your last theme, really. Social media promotes inflexibility by delivering opinions and evidence to people which support their existing views, so the echo chamber stuff, thus strengthening their mind prison walls. How can we try and change this? I suppose that you can answer that on the level of an individual and on the level of a society, I guess.
Yeah, I believe there's been attempts to try and change the algorithms on sites like Facebook, so they are less kind of keep you in a bubble of reinforcement. So I think there's something at the level of the coding and the engineering that they're trying to figure out in Silicon Valley. At a personal level, you can try and follow people you disagree with and say, am I being heterodox in my information sources? Or am I overly relying on one particular perspective? Am I getting all my news sources from one particular bias? Can I occasionally check in with, I don't know, completely different news sources like Fox News or Al Jazeera and so on. So on Twitter, I try to follow people who have different political opinions to me, and it's very triggering. And, I want to argue with them, but at least I'm getting information about how different people see events, the same events that I'm seeing, but from a completely different perspective. So we can try and do that, have various different information sources and not be too quick just to assume that our habitual bias is the whole story.
Howard Smith, one of our parents at school, says it's a paradox that our current style of liberal democracy creates and rewards narcissists, as in Rome. And I noticed your somewhat pointed comments about Nero. I could sense the parallel you were drawing there.
Well, it looks a bit like Trump, doesn't it?
So I'm not sure that.
Yes. Well, I think there is a connection between liberal democracy and both narcissism and social anxiety. I've thought about that a lot. Yeah. You look at ancient Greece, and there's this idea, it's based on this idea, man is the measure of all things, which is a quote by a philosopher called Protagoras. So you don't look to the gods for value, you look to other people. And in a way that can be liberating. We decide what is right or wrong. But it can turn into, it's whatever the public decides, whatever looks good to the public, whatever the public likes. So liberal democracy creates this big incentive to put a lot of effort into your appearance, into your self-presentation, because then you can really rise to the top of society through the ability to manage public opinion. So in other words, the public becomes the new God. And that's why I think there's also a connection between liberal democracy and society. There's a philosopher called Theodore Zeldin who says, public opinion is the new purgatory. You think about, I don't know if you've ever been subject to kind of public shaming online. There's a great book about this by John Ronson called You've Been Publicly Shamed. When you become subject of a social media hate mob. But that's really the kind of modern equivalent of the Furies in the ancient world. So both narcissism, that sense of self-inflation when you get a lot of approval, and anxiety, like what if the public don't like me? And I had bad social anxiety when I was younger. And I think in a society that puts a lot of emphasis on appearance and status, we need to develop something intrinsic that doesn't depend on approval, doesn't depend on the up and down of the stock market of public opinion. A kind of inner core, I think, is quite an important part of our self-education to help us be resilient in that kind of narcissist society.
I don't know whether I can ask you a somewhat more personal question. I just wonder whether you could share with us how, almost on a daily basis, your understanding of philosophy impacts on the way that you look after yourself. I know that it's somewhat personal, but quite interesting for someone who, maybe hasn't thought that through like I have. How does it work? Do you read philosophy every day? Do you spend some time meditating on things? What do you do for your own well-being?
I'll be honest, Chris. Like I really used philosophy in myself in my life in the really hard times. Like I would say that's when in the worst times of my life, that was when I grew most and had to swim the hardest and really change my automatic beliefs. And examine my automatic philosophy. So I don't do that so much anymore because life is, thankfully life is easier. So I have I've built a slightly better life philosophy. But the daily practices I do now would be things like I try to do some contemplation in that kind of Quaker way for 15 minutes in the morning. I try to think about, whether I'm actually doing activities that are in alignment with my values. Sometimes I sometimes do this thing of looking back over the day. It's a stoic thing and thinking, what did I do well today? What did I do badly? Was I nice to people? Was I kind? Was I a bit short to that person? Do that kind of thing. What I love as well is I love curiosity and I love learning and I love communicating. So I do this kind of this thing called philosophy safaris, which is one-on-one philosophy sessions where an idea and I research it and then we do it in a session online. And I don't know, it's like I did Taoism 2 weeks ago and I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed learning about Taoism and their perspective. Or I did Ralph Waldo Emerson last week. And that was fascinating to me. I'd read him before, but rereading Self-Reliance and so on. So I guess I love that sense of being engaged in a really good conversation with the greatest minds that have ever lived and thinking about their perspectives. And the way to approach that is to realize that none of them are gods. None of them are totally right and true, but they've all got an interesting perspective. So even a philosopher you really don't like, or you really find is a bit dangerous, like Nietzsche is some ways quite an offensive, dangerous philosopher, there's still something quite interesting in his perspective. So that's the most ongoing thing about what I do, is that feeling of joining that conversation and bringing other people into that great conversation. That's my real kind of weekly practice.
Excellent. Howard follows up with another question, which is a really interesting one, I think. Have you looked at how all these philosophical lessons can be applied to work/business, and what additional challenges that represents? So, in terms of sort of real world application of these things in the context of that sort of work.
Yes, I mean, I've tried to do this in businesses before, beyond Saracens, but I personally didn't like working in a corporate environment. Like I went to did a philosophy session in Allianz, and I didn't feel that people wanted to be there, and it was just I just didn't enjoy it. But some people have done that. There have been in-house philosophers at like General Motors and so on. I do a lot of work with entrepreneurs in like Silicon Valley. A lot of my clients are entrepreneurs, and they are very interested in philosophy and in kind of ideas and meaning, and increasingly using philosophy to think through things like, say, the ethics of AI is a very hot topic. Also, things like viewpoint diversity in workplaces. So one of my clients at their company, they had some people that were, this is classic California, that were very libertarian, and some that were very on the social justice left. And there was a real fight within their company organization. And so it was thinking about, how do you deal with that within a company? How do you engineer good conversations, a good culture within a company? Likewise, questions like how we were talking about schools developing a good culture and yet creating room for heretics. Exactly the same thing in a company. You want good culture and values, but you want it still to be a place for the heretics, the awkward people, like in a team. Can you be a team that has a place for, I can't remember his name now, who was the really difficult English cricketer who was originally from South Africa? Peterson. Yeah, so can you have a team that has that kind of awkward person in it as well? Or like Dennis Rodman in the Chicago Bulls, for example. So creating the room for the oddballs and the heretics as well. So there's lots of ways like that. Yeah, I mean, so I particularly like working with entrepreneurs, and they think a lot about it. Yeah.
Just to finish off with, I know that you're part of a project called Larger Us, which I think you've worked on with your brother Alex on, and that really took my attention when it came across my Twitter feed a little while ago. I just wonder whether it's worth just finishing off by giving us some insight into what you're trying to do with that project.
Well, yeah, I mean, my older brother Alex, he can. You'll have to get him on, but he talk very. I mean, it's his project, and he just brought on his younger brother to get some help. But I'll tell you what it's trying to do is he's saying, what can we do about polarization? It's a question that so many people are asking. What can we do about an increasingly divided, polarized society? And he's trying to think about how we can look beyond our tribal differences to get a sense of a larger us. He's also trying to think about coping with things like climate change in terms of stories and myths as well. So he wrote a book called The Myth Gap, looking at why these bigger collective stories can be helpful. And one of the things he's also looking at is connecting the inner and the outer. So connecting external politics with kind of inner work. Helping, for example, activists and campaigners not to get burnt out. So what are the kind of mental health or self-care practices which can help people working to outer change? And likewise, how can you help people who are very into inner change to be a bit more connected to changing the world? And this is, supreme Quaker territory, isn't it? Because the Quakers are real pioneers at that kind of contemplative activism. Both the moments of quiet and the looking into your kind of inner light, but then always taking that to kind of working to try and change external conditions, working for justice. So I think there's lots to be learnt, and that balance as well.
It looks like we've frozen Jules again at the last moment.
I'm back.
You're back. Brilliant. I think we'll have to get Alex to come and talk about that too. I mean, he did come and talk to us about the myth gap about 3 years ago, and it was fantastic. So we're getting back in to talk about larger us, because, as you say, there's so much resonance for a Quaker school with the sort of thing that he's trying to do and that you're helping him with. Jules, thank you so much for giving us your time this evening. I could listen to you forever. I really, really love the way that you make things and long words and complicated things from people whose brain are far bigger than mine. Very, very accessible to me, and certainly some practical ways to sort of to look at life around me as a consequence. So it's been a real pleasure having you here again. I hope we get you back for a third occasion before you go anywhere else for a second. And it's been lovely to have you. Stay safe in Costa Rica. All the best, and we hope to see you again. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. Stay safe as well.
Thank you very much. There we are, folks. That's it for now. We'll get in touch as soon as we can with news of other talks that we've got coming up. I believe that the next one is the 23rd of March, and it features the Cabinet Secretary, I've forgotten his the head of the civil service, let's call him that, there it is, who is Simon Case, talking about Sir Jeremy Hayward, former Bootham student, about whom a book has been written by his wife, out this week. Interesting reviews out that. And I've just been reminded on screen here, the 9th of March is indeed our next talk, a month today. Professor Richard Tuckett talking about the climate emergency, what is the science and what should we do? And he's another old scholar coming to talk to us about his experience and talk to us about his ideas. And I'm sure you'll find that interesting too. So please join us for both of those. Thank you for being here tonight, and all the very best to you.